webinar through various polls. So it is a humble request for all to participate in those polls and let us know what are your views on on those topics. The last one is we'll be having a Q&A session at the end. So keep posting your questions and queries, and we'll be taking care, we'll be addressing them at the end of the session. Now over to Dee.
Thank you so much for the really lovely warm welcome, and thank you to you and Inclusify for having me. And good morning / good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world, to all our attendees. Really excited to talk about LGBTQ inclusion. I was so excited that I moved to the next slide before I should have. So now I'll go to the next slide. This is just to explain, and I think Saloni, you did a really lovely way of telling people who I am. So my name is Dee, and I am the founder of Colourfull. And I think aside from being just a D&I consultancy that focuses on LGBTQ inclusion, in addition to that, I look at issues of race, which is a pertinent issue in the UK. But more importantly, I have lived experience of this community, and having had to work my career through and becoming ultimately a people director, I've gone through the different challenges that an LGBT person faces in the workplace and how to get to a leadership role. So that really informs the way that I think about LGBTQ inclusion. And obviously you can follow Colourfull on both LinkedIn as well as Instagram and Twitter, just to keep up to date with the things that we do. So on to the next slide. So I called this a recipe specifically for this very reason, that it's very personal in terms of the things that I will share. And I love this quote that I found, which is, if God had intended us to follow recipes, he wouldn't have given us grandmothers. So I'm not anyone's grandmother, but what I am saying is, in the way that I've learned how to cook Indian food from scratch from my grandmother, it's an authentic recipe. She taught me how to make Indian food authentically. And I hope that my experience as an LGBT person who is of an Indian background also allows me to share this authentic recipe on how we can create inclusion in your workplaces. So I think we're going to do a fun quiz for now. So we're going to try these polls. Saloni is like going to shoot some questions your way.
Yes, definitely.
I can also read them out if that's helpful, but I think the first question is, what is the projected value of the LGBTQ market in India? So this was an assumption made by someone. This has been quoted externally in the media, but what do you all see as the projected value of the LGBTQ market in India? So we'll give you a few seconds or so to answer. Oh, brilliant. So everyone knew the answer already. This is how what's the right word? So many of you are clearly reading the same information as me, which is brilliant. The answer is $200 billion. And this was actually said by Parmej Shahani, the head of Godrej Culture Lab, as part of a Pride event discussion. And he made the assumption that if the LGBTQ market globally is worth up to $5 trillion, assuming that India's LGBT population is somewhere between 4 to 6%, we can extrapolate from that. And obviously this is a really significant number. This shows beyond just the moral case, which is super important, which we will talk about, just the commercials around understanding the LGBTQ market, engaging with them and developing products and services for them. There's significant value for organizations. So on to the next one. So I won't read these out, but we'll give you a few seconds to respond again. Mm-hmm. Interesting. So almost an even split for for the first two answers. And actually the correct answer is 56%. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that more than, say, 1 in 2 LGBT people have felt discriminated at some point during their workplace experience. And this was actually a piece of research shared by Inc. 42, but it came from the World Bank report. So it just is interesting to know that even if this isn't explicitly shared with everyone, there are people who feel discriminated in some way, which is obviously important to acknowledge. So on to the next one.
Just give me a second.
Am I too fast?
No, no.
So what percentage of India's workforce is out? Interesting. Yep. So the correct answer is actually 8%. So I love the kind of optimism that some of the higher percentages were chosen, even though they are still relatively low. But 8%, even I was genuinely surprised when I saw this statistic. And this was from a piece of research done by Culture Wizard. And then the final question. That's a good spread. And the answer is actually 20%. So of course we want that to be even higher as we continue to build the case for LGBTQ inclusion. But this was a piece of research done by the Boston Consulting Group. And they looked at organizations in different markets across the world to see how their financial performance looked in relation to having an explicit statement that prohibited LGBTQ inclusion versus firms that didn't. And what they found is that those firms that did have that explicit statement had 20% more or 20% higher revenue percentage points. And most of that money came from international business. So it makes good business sense by having that in place as well. So thank you very much for participating. Hopefully that gives a bit of a picture as to why LGBTQ inclusion is important, both for both the individual as well as businesses. So I just wanted to talk through a model that I tend to use here with my clients in the UK. So I tend to look at how we can approach inclusion in any shape or form, regardless of what community we're talking about. But obviously today we're talking about the LGBTQ community. There's 3 layers. So I often ask people to think about where they are on this journey, and we'll share a poll at the end of this slide. But the first thing is to think about the moral case. So some organizations begin with this. They think about, at a very basic level, LGBTQ people are in fact people and therefore deserve respect and should be able to work in a workplace with dignity and free of discrimination. And so that's a really nice place to start. But obviously, as someone from that community, I'm always saying there's more we can do. So the next level up is what we call the business and moral case. So the moral case is still present, but at this point, we're talking about how can businesses really empower the LGBTQ talent that they have in their organization? What are they doing to help them succeed in the workplace? So that could touch upon the policies and practices you have, and that may even look like having an LGBTQ staff network. It's just thinking about how you value people through action. And then the kind of final level at the very top is what I call nirvana. So the dividend driver. How do you actually use these insights and the talent that you have to shape the market and shape your business performance? So So specifically, how are LGBTQ talent in your organization helping you design new products and services and tapping into new markets? Converse is a really great example of doing this for Pride last year, where they worked with their LGBTQ staff network to design specific products for Pride Month and used a percentage of that revenue to donate back to charity. So it just shows how you can build brand reputation, create engagement, and obviously tap into a new market. So I think we're going to throw you another poll just to see where you all are in relation to your journeys at the moment. Super interesting.
Yeah.
And to be honest, it's reflective of what's happening in the UK as well. Maybe there's more people in the business and moral case and less people in just the moral case. I think the dividend driver is definitely where we're all pushing, and that's why we're on this call today. But to say that that kind of reflects, I think, also maybe from India's legislation and current context, that kind of makes sense to me as I see those scores. So thank you for sharing, and hopefully some of this stuff will help you move into the business and moral case. I'll move to the next slide. So why is it challenging in India? So again, I want to be as humble as I can. Although I'm Indian, I recognize that I'm not an Indian who is currently in India all of my working time. But these are some of the observations I made, as well as the feedback I received from conversations I had. So I was actually in India earlier this year for about 2 months. So the first for me that really stood out was the lack of legal protection. So it's great that Section 377 has been read down and therefore decriminalized, but actually has that translated into everyday workplace protections or civil rights protections for the LGBTQ community? So I think the fact that you could still be discriminated at work on the basis of your sexual identity or gender identity, I think has an impact on people's ability to come out. The second is actually discomfort, and I have a personal story. So this is kind of where people, I think, are aware of the LGBTQ agenda, the pride movement, etc., but just feel uncomfortable. So I was in Mumbai and I went to see my dad's side of the family, and I found this really strange, but my cousins would only speak to me about my sexuality and my identity when their parents weren't in the room. So they were super supportive. They were not, they were excited to know that I was going to Pride, but they wouldn't talk about it in front of their parents. So there's clearly some discomfort about giving me support, which they were happy to do, but a real sense of discomfort about being publicly associated with supporting me. And I think that is something that is unique, which maybe isn't as common in the UK, but I definitely felt while I was in India. This kind of links quite closely to societal pressure, because I think through, I suppose in those situations, what I have found is that, again, people may want to be helpful. I think people do want to help and support, but that kind of familial and societal pressure may prevent people from doing so, or make people second guess to what extent they may go to a Pride event. I asked my cousins to come along, but they felt that that would be a step too far. They didn't say that to me directly, but they talked about having to do other errands, etc. on the weekend, and I didn't push them further because I didn't want to make them feel uncomfortable. And then the final bucket is social conditioning. So when I talk to people about the presence or the existence of LGBTQ people in India, there was an acknowledgement. Yes, of course we know they exist. And of course, like in any country, we all exist in some shape or form as a percentage of the population. But there seems to be a kind of instinctive reaction whereby maybe we have been conditioned by the societies that we're in to react against the existence of LGBTQ people. And what I'm trying to say here is that I feel gender norms, particularly the role of what a man is and what a woman is, was prevalent for me in India. And so the social conditioning of what that meant to be an LGBTQ person often there could be quite a negative connotation with that. So that's just the kind of context that I observed, and of course we'll have some Q&A, so I'd love to hear your feedback on this. I'll keep moving to the next slide now, because we'll get to the ingredients. So ingredient number 1. So these are all ingredients helping you think about how can you begin your LGBTQ inclusion journey. For those that have already started, I hope that this is helpful in thinking about how you could enhance maybe some of your existing work, or it might just be a helpful reminder. So it goes without saying that without leadership on board, any initiative will fail. I say the word fail, I wrote the word falter, one of the two will happen. And I think how I've approached this in the past, particularly with either leaders that are resistant, or maybe even in organizations or market contexts that are resistant, was to always carry out a kind of stakeholder map of the existing leadership team. And that was based on the dimensions of interest versus influence. So I'd be looking to understand who in this leadership team is likely to be an advocate or a possible ally, and potentially in some cases, some of those leaders were LGBTQ themselves, but maybe they went out. So understanding who your leadership team is and where they sit on this spectrum of support for this work is hugely important. I think the next kind of part of this is using the right hooks. So I showed you that pyramid of like the business case versus the moral case. I've shared some financials today, which obviously show that this makes good business sense. I think knowing how to influence your leaders was probably even though it's such an obvious lesson, it was probably the most useful lesson for me to remember in how did I speak to each leader about this piece of work? Because in order to build up momentum, I wanted to address each individual leader before bringing them all together to get a sense of where they sat on this subject. And different things work for different people. Sometimes I used to use competitor information for the more competitive leaders that we have in our leadership teams, through to those who just understood that this was the right thing to do for their people. I think those one-to-one conversations are really important before a big board meeting or a group meeting with the leadership team, because I think at an individual level, you can connect with what their concerns may be and what challenges they may envisage, because I think we have to acknowledge not everyone starts in the same place. And the final lesson for me, because I'm the most impatient person in the world, is patience. I found that with one particular client, it took at least 3 conversations to reach a place where we could publicly say we were going to do this work. So the groundwork might be hard, but actually this is the core first ingredient of leadership buy-in. Has been amazing in setting up the work that I've done in the past. So I think we're going to ask a quick poll question here, just to see how this fits with your current situation. This is brilliant. Great to see. It looks as though the majority are supportive. A small percentage who have an opportunity, but hopefully this is a helpful way of thinking about how to continue structuring those conversations, particularly for those who are, yes, in a verbally supportive place, how we get them to commit through action. It will be through conversation, but it's thinking through how do you orchestrate that. So I hope some of these tips are helpful, and we'll move on to the next slide. So kind of D&I as usual. And what I mean by this is I found that going in cold with just LGBTQ inclusion without a broader context of D&I in the organization was quite difficult. And certainly sometimes presenting initiatives for different types of work, be that race, be that gender, be that LGBTQ inclusion, could become quite tricky if there wasn't a kind of common understanding in the organization about what is D&I. So again, this may not feel like rocket science, but actually having this, I almost feel like this is one of the most important ingredients, because it's like the soil that you put in place. There's the seeds and there's the soil. This is definitely for me the soil, because this creates the enabling environment. So how do you create a broader culture of diversity and inclusion? And by that, I mean, what language are you using? What do your policies say? If I was to ask, I don't know, 5 people in your organization from different parts of the organization, what does D&I mean? And what does the work represent in your organization? Would they know would they be able to give me the same answer or a consistent answer? And there's so many opportunities in the ways that you can start to build a broader culture. For example, the way that you onboard new hires has been one of the most effective ways that I've seen, both through my own work, but also looking at other people's case studies, because it's the prime opportunity to impress the importance of what your organization stands for. If you are doing other pieces of work around D&I in your organization, it's to reflect on the successes and the lessons that you've learned from your existing D&I initiatives, and thinking about what can you template from that approach and take into the LGBTQ inclusion. I have definitely been guilty of this, where I have overseen numbers of different D&I streams of work, and I haven't connected the dots between them to understand, that's how I got leadership over the line on this particular thing, or this is how I secured additional investment for this piece of work. So I think thinking through what we've done, I think sometimes reflection, when we're moving so quickly in our organizations to deliver, reflection can sometimes feel like a luxury, but I found it to be the most useful thing that I've been able to do. And then the final piece, which is around how do you make this D&I as usual, is how you bring people together just to talk about D&I in general. So that could be an events program, that could be workshops, training, using the power of your staff network groups if you have them, in terms of how you do events programming, internal communications, not going overboard in terms of corporate communications, but genuinely human moments where you bring people together to learn about different identities and the importance of this subject. So I think we are going to ask another quick question here. This is a yes/no.
Let us launch that poll.
And Saloni, please keep me to time. If I need to move along quickly, you must say, and we should go to the next slide.
I will update you.
Awesome. So a good kind of mix of responses here, almost 50-50. So brilliant to hear where there is work currently underway. And actually the next slide will be quite relevant, and maybe how we as a group, as the people who are on this call, can share learning together. And for those that haven't, well then again, I just hope that this information is really useful in thinking about how you set yourself up to get to LGBTQ inclusion. I'll go to the next slide, which is about networks. So again, if I think of work where it's been a challenging market or context to begin D&I work, just the power of networks is super important. I think of that both in the context of internal and external. So if you are internal, I'm thinking this through the lens of, if you are part of a global organization or a regional organization, is there a D&I strategy that you can tap into? So maybe there is work happening centrally or at a regional level that you can use as the hook in which to, I don't want to say force, but to certainly push through the concept and the conversations around LGBTQ inclusion. I've seen it, for example, where a bank, for example, has had a central approach to LGBT inclusion around its global workforce, and that's been used as a lever to begin those conversations in market. I think you can often tap into central support and resources. And I also think of other, particularly if you are in a large organization, if there are other chapters or staff networks of LGBTQ networks, in other places around the world, how can you speak to those leaders to understand how they did the work and how they, what successes they had? So I think your internal network is definitely a source of support. The second one, which I think is common certainly for smaller organizations and for techs and startups, which is where I predominantly do my work in the UK now, is how can you connect with others, organizations that are in the same market or sector, and share those learnings and create change. So the example of this that I use is, rather than Facebook trying to show that they are the best in LGBTQ inclusion, and then Google's doing some work on the other side, actually, why aren't Facebook and Google working together? Because these issues are human issues. And in my mind, this isn't about scarcity and accolades. It's great to be celebrated for your work, but actually this should be about abundance. How are we uplifting a community, and how can we as organizations work across with each other to really create societal change? If you do have LGBT people in your organizations who are either out or just out to you, or even a staff network that currently exists, could you engage with them to think through how you scope your work, how you build the work, how you even think about influencing leadership, etc. If they are willing to and able to, they can be hugely powerful. And then kind of the other external network that I think of is the final point, which is sometimes we don't know it all. I don't know everything about each strand of D&I, and so I'm constantly encouraging my clients to bring in external thinking when needed and where they can afford to help strengthen their work, because you just get an external perspective very quickly, and you have someone who's got practical experience of helping you do this work. So that's the power of networks. Ingredient number 4, and I'm speeding up a little bit just because I want to make sure we have time for your questions. So what I found is that rather than centering the experience or the inclusion journey on LGBTQ people directly on them immediately, is to actually start beginning with allyship. So again, using broader events or broader hooks to begin the right conversations about LGBTQ inclusion in the workplace. So the most obvious things that come to mind are Pride, International Day Against Homophobia, etc., Transgender Visibility Day, those types of moments which are agnostic of your company, but are moments which can lead to people, whether they are in the community or not, to begin having conversations. And that kind of almost neutralizes it, rather than we are doing this in our company. How do we feel about it? Let's have some conversations about what's happening in the world. And if this sits in the broader context of talking about D&I, actually this can be really successful. Ultimately, it's about starting these conversations. I've seen the kind of power of what happens when you have well facilitated but good conversations around how you can build allyship, by showing data, by sharing the experiences or case studies of people that are at the receiving end of such marginalization or oppression. And just to make sure that I don't forget some points, it's really thinking about how your leadership can invite allies to become a member of this community. Also thinking about how can you build that momentum. So if you have done some work already in, for example, celebrating Pride, how can you use this to maybe start thinking about co-opting allies to either become part of a Pride movement or to become part of your staff network if you have an ally space for them. Simple visible things like from posters to having a rainbow lanyard can go a long way. And mostly, I think there's a benefit for those who identify as LGBTQ. If they aren't out in the workplace, they're then able to bring an element of their identity into the workplace and participate in some of those activities and discussion. So I think allyship is absolutely there to build allyship, but it kind of brings in people from the community who may not have that visibility. So I'll move on to the final ingredient, and then I think I will stop talking, which is always a good thing, is just policy, practice, and workplace. And I feel you will all know about this already, so I won't sweat this one too much. but actually the kind of what it feels like, to kind of quote Maya Angelou, people don't remember what you say, they remember how you make them feel. So the question I ask my clients is, how does your organization make LGBTQ people feel? And how do you know that they feel that way? So the first thing is, just be as bold as you can in saying that you don't tolerate discrimination of LGBTQ people in any shape or form. I think that just in and of itself sends a tone and a message in your workplace, and then enables broader conversations to begin. Because if you're allowing for discrimination to happen, or you don't have a stance on it, then how can you do all the other things about empowering your talent, etc., if you can't protect them from the most brutal part of oppression, which is discrimination? Obviously, looking at your existing policies just to ensure that they are inclusive, both from language through to application. So by language, thinking about gender neutral language all the way through, all the way to application of policies and processes, such as your reward policy, and do benefits extend to the same-sex partners, or non-binary partners as well, ensuring that that's taken into account. I think the third kind of piece for me is not typical practice, but from my discussions and work that I have done so far in India, mental health support was seen as really important to the LGBTQ community. So of course, this is useful to everyone, particularly with kind of COVID at the moment. Having mental health support in place is a brilliant thing to do, full stop. But actually, how can this be used as a way to accelerate LGBTQ inclusion, or at least enable people to feel supported, even if that policy isn't branded as an LGBTQ policy? It's a benefit that I'm finding is valued very much by the community. So actually just having something like that in place goes a long way. And then often just gender neutral facilities. So if you have the budget and have the office space in which to do so, I would encourage starting with that, because it's a small change, but it has a huge impact on making those that feel unseen feel visible in the workplace. So that was the kind of fifth and final ingredient. I will stop there. I think there's a quick poll we're going to ask on this particular slide before we move into broader Q&A.
That's
Yes.
amazing.
Yes, I know, this makes me so happy. This is a great way to start a Wednesday. This is fantastic news. So 7 out of 10 of you explicitly prohibit LGBTQ discrimination in your workplace, which is really positive. And hopefully the 29%, you're moving in that direction. And depending on what connections we can make offline with the attendees, hopefully there's kind of lessons that can be learned and practices that can be exchanged to help further that inclusion and obviously prohibit discrimination. And as we know, it can lead to more money. So even for the kind of cynics in all of us, there's definitely a place for prohibiting discrimination. I will stop there. I think we've got a couple of questions coming through. But yeah, thank you so much for listening to those 5 kind of ingredients. I hope they help you think about your existing LGBTQ inclusion journey. We'll take some questions and then we'll close. So, there we go. So we'll go to here. I can see 2 questions have come through so far, and there's a few more coming through. So someone has asked a question, which is, so before any initiative is launched or proposed, I will be asked how many staff members this will benefit. It's a catch-22 situation where staff who do not or will not identify as LGBTQ because they cannot see support in the workplace which obviously also has an impact on management who may not commit resources. So yeah, that catch-22, if there are people who are not visibly out, then management will ask why is this, why this investment? So I think this requires a nuanced approach. I think for me, management are the people that have, or leadership, those that have power. So it's about working with them first and foremost to understand not just the LGBTQ community, but D&I as a whole. So like, what's the spirit of this work? And when we begin, how do we include people who are different to each of us in that? And some of those people may not be visible if we think about the LGBTQ community, and helping them understand why that might be the case. Because I think with D&I work, as we probably know, it's not instinctively, you don't see the reward immediately. What you're doing is you're building a culture that will hopefully support your employer brand, help you retain talent, and ultimately help you win in your marketplace. So I would do two things with the leadership team. First and foremost is talk through the, I suppose, D&I as a concept, why LGBT people in particular are less likely to be open and out, but we shouldn't assume that to be the case, and what the business benefits are of promoting LGBTQ inclusion. And the second piece is thinking it through from an economic case, to think about how does your organization work with the LGBT community external to your organization? What opportunities does this present? That would be a starting place that I would recommend.
We have another question. This question is, the person is saying that he always wonder that companies who brand themselves as inclusive on policy level, also really keen to bring it in the culture and being a change in true sense. He's asking, he would like to know your thoughts on this.
Okay. So if I've understood correctly, Saloni, so it's saying that we're brilliant at policy, but maybe behavior or application, there might be a gap, and how do you change that?
Right.
So I always go back to positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement when I think of behavior change. So which is ultimately helps build culture. In my mind, my theory of culture is an expression of behaviors. I would do two things. I think the first is when brilliant things happen in relation to the application of your policies. So when you are doing something in your policy and it's being applied well, for example, if you say that you are truly inclusive and you decide to make flexible working a norm, you implement gender neutral facilities and other things that you may do, I think you need to celebrate them, because I think when people see that good things happen, they're more likely to continue doing those good things and believe in those good things. And that could be measured through the way your employees respond in terms of employee engagement surveys. I also think it's important to recognize great people managers, because if you recognize them and celebrate them, because they ultimately tend to implement these decisions or manage those people in their teams with hopefully sensitivity, if the more you celebrate them and reward them, the more of them they become. That becomes a stand for cultural practice, people management practice, and how you create positive change. The flip side I would use is, how do you, if something doesn't go well, or if people are behaving in a way that is outside of policy, how do you hold people to account? So I don't just mean disciplinaries and firing people, that may be appropriate depending on the case, but more, how do you hold yourselves to account? Is that through doing a survey and seeing what scores are telling you and genuinely taking action in relation to that? Is it taking feedback in different ways, or learning from your staff network groups about the work that maybe hasn't gone as well as it could have, and rectifying that quickly? I think making sure you have a culture of like feedback to understand when it's not working well, and taking action helps to build a culture that is evolving, learning and growing together.
So we have another question. It is quite interesting one. So the person is asking, should organizations start using gender pronouns for the employees? Should they ask that?
Interesting. So obviously I always think yes, but I realize that that's coming from my place in the community and putting my professional hat back on. I think there needs to be a level of education around introducing this. So yes, it's a simple thing to do and makes a big difference. So I would say move to that place quickly, but I think you need to be clear as to why you're asking people to do that, because it's beyond just visibility. It's around inclusivity. It's also challenging our assumptions that when we see someone, we don't assume them to be of a certain gender identity. And it means that we have to acknowledge the presence of trans people, non-binary people, and other people in the spectrum who may identify differently, such as gender fluid. So absolutely, yes, move to that. I would be thinking through the lens again, though, like what D&I work have you done in your organization already? To what extent has LGBTQ inclusion been discussed? And how do you use that to support a conversation on introducing gender pronouns?
Okay, great. So another question is, our clientele tends to be conservative and management is worried that taking a stand may be impact on business. Any
Okay.
thoughts on how to approach this discussion?
Yeah. So I think this is definitely, this is like, there's no easy way through this, I think. So I think there has to be a kind of sense of coming back to why is your, why would, let me kind of structure my thoughts so I don't rush my answer, because I want to, this is a really important question. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is thinking through what types of repercussions do you anticipate from, say, suppliers or the market. I think it's always good to do a bit of risk or scenario planning, because once you've done that and you've named your risks, you can start to think about how likely it is that they will happen and actually how severe they may be. And sometimes just doing that, naming things, is quite a calming thing to do, but it also makes you feel proactive if there is something deliberate that you do off the back of that exercise. I think more importantly, it's coming back to helping the management team understand, again, the value of this work. So there's an equation here, or an inherent tension, that we may do something that may not land well with certain people. So how can we introduce those conversations in a safer way? So I found that using gender as an initial approach into this area, and then bringing LGBTQ inclusion into that discussion, is one way of helping bridge the gap between no discussion straight to LGBTQ. And I think with kind of suppliers, it's thinking through the business benefit, not just for yourself as an organization, but what value could this bring to the supplier by investing in D&I work and being gender diverse and being gender open. And maybe that's the language that's used to encapsulate your commitment. So I think you can use language to be your ally, and I think, but you need to still go back to why you're doing that work and why it makes sense for your business to do that.
Okay, done. So I think we should wrap up this discussion. There is one last question that I want to ask. So there's one participant who's asking that he wants to come out to his parents and the society. He's asking for any suggestion which you can help him with.
Okay. So I think obviously this is slightly different to the workplace, but I can give a perspective. So I think the first thing is obviously acknowledging where we are right now. We're in the thick of a pandemic and we're in the middle of a lockdown. So if this person is potentially considering coming out now, I would be asking them why now? Like, is this the right time? Given how I'm sure like there is a level of stress, tension, anxiety for all of us, and particularly if we're in a quarantine situation, is this the right time to come out? Because you need to protect your safety. And by safety, I mean not just physical, but emotional and mental safety as well. If COVID wasn't happening, what I would advise this person to do is maybe to speak to someone close in their inner circle, maybe a member of their family, someone that they really trust, first. Because if I think of my coming out journey, I spoke to my brother first, and actually he was extremely supportive, which was very lucky. And that says a lot about him and the kind of person he is as well. But he was very helpful in helping me navigate how to tell my parents, and also having conversations with my parents that I couldn't have. So there were moments where I'm sure they needed to express things that maybe I wouldn't have not been happy to hear, but he was there to be an ally and support me through that process. So I would definitely find at least one person you can tell first, and use that to shape the way that you might approach telling your extended family and your parents.
I think this is quite a quite helpful suggestion that you are giving. We are having few more questions, but we are running out of time. So we'll be sharing a few posts on our social media handles, and we'll be answering to your questions. For now, we are wrapping up the discussion. Thanks a lot, Dee, for an amazing and insightful session, and thanking all our attendees for their active participation and for their valuable time. We hope that our objective of stepping ahead in creating an inclusive tomorrow and creating our society more inclusive for LGBT community and for everyone. So we hope that we are a step ahead in our objective, and we'll be bringing many more exciting webinars, discussion, podcast on our platform. So stay tuned with us, and thank you for joining.
Thank you very much. Take care, everyone. Bye.